Hey there and welcome back to another Pixar video. And a few days ago, I made a video talking about Toy Story, and specifically, how I feel like Toy Story 4 damages the saga as a whole. And that really just got me in a Pixar mood and had me poking around on Reddit and movie forums reading about people's thoughts on all the different films. And pretty quickly, I noticed something. People really hate Cars, don't they? Really vitriolic hatred towards this franchise. And I'll admit, once upon a time, I was one such purist who truly believed that Cars was a pathetic money grab that was a blight on what had been Pixar's immaculate record. But recently, I actually watched Cars 1, and I'm starting to wonder, why the hell does this film get so much hate? Cars 1, in my opinion, is actually pretty good. And I know that people say this about anything and everything these days, but I would argue that it is actually heavily underrated as a film for reasons that I honestly don't think it deserves. So today, I'm essentially going to try and convince you why Cars is not as bad as you think, and so with all that being said, let's jump into the video. And the first reason that I can really see that people seem to hate on Cars is not because of the actual content of the film for the most part, but more because of the company it keeps. And of course, by that I mean its sequels, Cars 2 and Cars 3. And of these two, it's most definitely Cars 2 that brings the quality of the trilogy down immensely. Cars 1 tells the story of Lightning McQueen, an up-and-coming racer who displays all the trappings of an elite athlete or celebrity who's never been told no. He's brash and cocky and arrogant. He does what he pleases, and he has a much holier-than-thou attitude to those he considers beneath him. After destroying the road in a small town that he's found himself stranded in, he's forced to fix that road. And as he does so, he learns about life in the America of yesteryear. The small towns that were forgotten as new highways and interstates and bypasses were built. He forms a friendship with the local doctor who teaches him about racing and reveals his own past in the sport. And he grows to appreciate the quiet serenity of Radiator Springs and embraces his newfound friendship with the community. They help him turn away from his arrogant ways, culminating in a touching moment in the final act of the film where he helps an old racer pass the finish line at the cost of the Piston Cup. But then Cars 2, where you anticipate that this story will continue, becomes a weird spy thriller starring Mater, who's completely and utterly flanderized and overexposed to the point that he's no longer funny in Cars 2, or Cars 3, or on rewatch of Cars 1. It feels like a direct-to-home video sequel that classically follows along the character that made you laugh, and you realise that they're no longer funny, but instead extremely annoying, and you wonder how the main character of the original film could have ever put up with them in real life. This movie is the Kronk's new groove of its time. It spoils Mater so utterly that you never want to see him on your screen again. And so it not only kind of poisons you against seeing him again in Cars 3, but poisons you against Cars 1 as a whole somewhat. He's no longer as funny as you remembered, and that toxicity permeates into other aspects of the film. And that brings me to Cars 3. And don't get me wrong, I don't think this movie's bad per se, but I also don't think it really matches up all that well with Cars 1. Where in Cars 1, the young and brash and dynamic Lightning McQueen needs to learn the value of the old school and the techniques of the past to become a truly great racer, Cars 3 goes the opposite direction and paints him as out of touch completely and unable to adapt to the new world of racing. And I think that's a fine story, but it really just does run contrary to what I think the messaging of that first film was, whilst also ramping up the silliness and hyper-focusing on action instead of fleshed out character development and the interactions between the characters. And so we end up left with a film that, whilst not being bad, I don't think I would class it as overly good. It sits solidly in the okay category. And you might argue that the quality of the sequel films and what came after is totally irrelevant to how Cars is perceived. But I would argue that is not the case. I mean, look at Game of Thrones. I think it's widely agreed that the first 4 seasons are some of the best TV of all time. Or at least, they were. And they really brought back traditional medieval style fantasy to mainstream popularity. Everybody was watching, everybody was loving it. It was a cultural phenomenon. And then seasons 5 and 6, they were decent, but the popularity still held. Season 7 was reasonably poor, but people were ready to finish it off strong. And then season 8 came along, and is considered to be perhaps the worst ending to a long-running franchise ever in the history of humanity. And now, nobody talks about it. Nobody cares about it. Nobody wants to see it. Yeah, they have their sequels, but somehow I doubt those will ever be able to fully free themselves of the taint either. Because it ended so poorly, it retroactively made the earlier seasons less enjoyable, as you know it all ends up going to shit. Another example is the animated series The Tales of Arcadia, an animated show that was coming close to the level of critical acclaim that Avatar The Last Airbender had when it first released. It was a truly solid franchise. And then, the quality began to dip ever so slightly with its spin-off sequel series. But that didn't matter because the overall story was still good. And then they decided to end everything in a film where they reversed everything you've seen over all the seasons in a time travel twist. So now, the whole journey you went on for a cumulative 6 seasons in a film meant absolutely nothing. And I think this makes it clear that once you've read or watched something that's canonically related to a media you once found enjoyable, it doesn't matter if the original entity was good, it's forever tarnished because you can't wind yourself back to a point where you can erase the memory of this terrible extension of the story. It's still there sitting at the back of your mind no matter how much you try and ignore it. And I think it's the same principle for Cars. The legacy of the first film is tarnished by the existence of the trash second film. And the third film fails to redeem the franchise as a whole because it's mostly just a bit meh. And so, Cars simply looks bad via association with the warm, steamy turd that is Cars 2. But that does not seem to be the only reason that people seem to dislike Cars. A big reason that I saw was that people don't think it feels like a Pixar film. I think for a lot of people, Pixar films have become this otherworldly experience. A hybrid film, half blockbuster, half art house Oscar bait. They look at things like Finding Nemo and The Incredibles, Ratatouille and Toy Story, Up, Inside Out, WALL-E, You Get the Drift. All these films that managed to straddle that line, that made you feel something special, that contributed to the art form, whilst also destroying the box office. These films are financially successful whilst also telling a unique and meaningful story and breaking new ground. They make you think and feel more deeply than you would expect from an animated film that's primarily designed to be family entertainment. But then people have a look at Cars, and they see the big cartoon faces, and the racing, and they say, oh, this is a film designed to bait little boys into buying shit tons of merch. And yeah, true that. I very much agree. But isn't that the exact same concept as Toy Story? Where the story literally focuses on toy characters that you can now buy in every shop in the world? In my opinion, it's just smart marketing. And so when it comes down to it, I really do think that it's that simple visual perspective that leads people to turn up their noses at the film. I mean, if you remove the cartoon cars and just have them be actual people in a race, suddenly, in my opinion, the film feels more Pixar, more classic Pixar at least. I mean, just take a look at the story. This is premium Pixar, isn't it? You have a young up-and-comer who blows his chance at glory. He gets stranded out in the middle of nowhere and damages a small town's road. Over time, he's humbled by the populace of the town and spends his time training with an old racer and fixing the road he destroyed, before returning to the city to race, and proving himself a changed man by helping an old racer cross the finish line, as opposed to taking the glory for himself. Seriously, based on that premise, it reeks of Pixar. But for some reason, I feel like everybody likes to take the piss because of how it looks. And I'm not really quite sure that that's a fair take to have. Yeah, they're clearly designed to appeal to kids, and rednecks, and to try and get them to buy the toys, but does that make it a bad film? I don't think so. And then, there's one more final element to look at that I think clouds a lot of people's judgment regarding Cars. It isn't as good as most other Pixar films. And so people take that to mean that it's trash, and they form a bias against it. But once again, I don't find that totally fair. Just as a narrow framework, the majority of Pixar's films clock in on like 90% plus on Rotten Tomatoes? Almost all of them are in that ballpark. And then we get to Cars and it's like, 74%? And that is not a bad score at all. But compared to what you're used to seeing from Pixar, it is relatively low. It's like a super genius getting a reasonable but still lower grade on a test than what you'd be used to seeing. In a way, it's jarring, and so you're less able to accept that it's still a good score simply because of the high standard that's been set by the studio with its other films. It's like how Disney and Pixar are constantly pushing boundaries on how hyper-realistic they're able to make their animated assets. And yet, whilst they constantly push further and further, they don't get nearly as much praise because they're still hitting that expected standard. We now know to expect them to keep pushing the medium forward, and so they get less credit than they probably deserve, especially when you compare them to a lot of other studios that use a similar visual style. And hell, when they step even slightly away from that norm, people get so upset. Does Onward ring any bells? Despite having a cool and unique and distinct animation style that looked really good, people said it looked too DreamWorks for Pixar, not realistic enough. And thus, whilst it was still a good movie, there was this aura of negativity that surrounded its release and tainted the film and created a bias against it. And I think that's basically what happened to Cars. So yeah, is Cars the best movie in history? No. Is it one of Pixar's worst films? Probably. After all, the standard is frickin' high. But is it bad? No, not at all. I just think we sort of lose sight of what the film's trying to do. We don't look deeper than the surface, and we let our preconceived notions corrupt the viewing experience, or at least, that's my opinion. But now I think I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of Cars? Like it? Hate it? Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.